Hi there, this is Andrea Maury of Drea Renee Knits, and today I'm going to be demonstrating how to do right and left leaning double decreases in half fisherman's rib. I am going to demonstrate these both English style, holding the working yarn in my right hand, known as throwing, and continental style, holding the working yarn in my left hand, also known as picking. I have here an odd number of stitches. I think I cast on about 21 stitches, and I just knit up a little bit of fabric, so I had a nice sturdy base to try these decreases out on. If you are new to half fisherman's rib, I will go ahead and link some more tutorials for you below the video in the description box. I want to start my decreases on the interior of my swatch just because they're a little more comfortable there. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm just going to knit one below, purl one to get past my edge here. So there's my knit one below and purl a stitch. So I'm going to be starting with the left leaning decrease, which I call an SB, knit two together, purl, or I'm sorry, pass. Not purl. So what you want to be looking for, we need to use 3 stitches for this decrease. We're going to decrease out 2 of those stitches. And in general, with a stitch pattern like this, that's a 2-stitch repeat. That's why we want to decrease out 2 stitches at a time so we can stay in our 2-stitch pattern. And to make this look the most beautiful, I want to start with a knit column under my first stitch, purl column in the middle, and a knit stitch to end it. So these are my 3 stitches I'm going to be working with. Stitch number 1, I am going to slip 1 below. So I want to take my right hand needle and I want to slip this stitch as if to knit. And I don't just want the stitch that's on my needle, I want the one below. So I'm going to insert my needle as if to knit. And you can see I have both the stitch below and the one on my needle, 2 strands of yarn that I will now slip from the left over to the right. So there's step 1. Step 2, I need to knit these 2 stitches together, but I do want to continue keeping this column as a knit one below column. So I'm going to go ahead and prep this stitch so it's ready for me. So I'm just going to move the middle stitch out of the way temporarily, and I am going to insert my right hand needle tip from behind into the stitch below. I'm going to pop this stitch off my needle. So now I have the stitch above and the stitch below as 2 strands over my needle tip, and I'm going to replace them onto my left hand needle. I'm also going to return that middle stitch I had moved to get out of the way, and now I can knit these 2 together. So it's still a knit 2 together, even though we've got 3 strands of yarn here we're working with. So let's work those together as one. And now I'm going to pass my slip stitch, which was 2 strands because I slipped it from below, over the top and off. And I like to give a nice little tug at the end of my decreases to keep them tidy. And you can see right there how that is now my left leaning decrease. So where once I had 3 stitches, I'm now down to 1. And it'll stay in pattern. We have a purl, knit, purl, knit. So let's show that again. We're going to do this continental style now. And I'm going to go ahead and purl 1 because, as I said, I want this decrease to begin and end with my knit columns. So stitch number 1 of the 3, we need to slip below knitwise. So I insert my right hand needle tip as if to knit into the stitch below, and I slip that to my right hand needle. So I now have 2 strands of yarn hanging out over on my right hand needle. I now need to knit 2 together. Now you can just try to manipulate these by going into the stitch below of your second stitch and then into the stitch before it and knit those together. It can just be very awkward to then get your yarn through there. It's definitely doable though, and now I could just pull those off. So it's really about your comfort level, what makes it easier for you. A lot of knitters, I do think, find that if they just go through, move this middle stitch temporarily out of the way, insert their right hand needle tip from behind, and we're going from behind so that we don't twist our stitch by going through the front. So we go through behind into the stitch below, pop it off of our left hand needle. Both strands are now together, and we can return it to the left hand needle along with that one we had temporarily moved. And now we can knit these two together. And then we pass our slip stitch, making sure to grab both strands of yarn over the top and off. And there is another left leaning decrease. So I'm going to quickly show you if I needed to undo this. I think it's really nice to know how to undo a decrease that can be a little more complicated like this, where we have moved some of our strands of yarn. So I'm going to demonstrate that quickly before we continue on to our right leaning decrease. So to undo this decrease, we want to work in reverse order. So the last thing we did was we passed our slip stitch over the top and off. So using our left hand needle tip, we would reinsert that needle into both strands of the stitch we had passed over and off, and we're going to slip it back onto our needle, going over the stitch we had passed them over. Then the step before that was the knit two together. So we want to insert our needle tip kind of following this strand of yarn here, like so. And then we can remove our right hand needle and tug that yarn out. We should have 3 strands of yarn because we had pulled up the stitch below here. And we might want to get that back into its original orientation. So let's go ahead to make this back so that the stitch is below where it used to be. We actually just want to re-purl this. So we're going to take our top strand here, and we're going to grab that other stitch going underneath. I'll show that one more time. So grabbing that bottom stitch and just pulling it out. And do you see how that re-purled it? And then I'm just making sure it's sitting on my needle in its correct orientation so that the front leg is forward. Slip our middle stitch back. Now we have our slip stitch below. We're also going to return that to our needle. And if we didn't want that lower stitch up on the needle tip, again, we would just re-purl this. So I'm inserting my needle tip and I'm grabbing the stitch below so that it's purled again. So now if I wanted to rework this, I would go into the stitch below. All right, so now let's move on to our right leaning double decrease. I call this one an SBKPP. We are again going to use 3 stitches. I'm going to start English style once more, holding my yarn in my right hand. And so for this decrease, we slip a stitch below, knit the middle stitch, pass our slip stitch over, and then we're also going to pass our 3rd stitch over the top as well. So let's see what that looks like. So starting just like we did with the left leaning decrease, we are going to go ahead and slip this stitch knitwise, going through the stitch below. Now we need to knit our middle stitch. And then we pass our slip stitch over the top and off, making sure to grab both strands of yarn. You can feel my stitch splitting, there we go. And now we want this stitch to be passed over as well. Again, I'm gonna prep this stitch. So going from behind, because this needs to be passed from below, I'm gonna go ahead and insert my right needle tip into the stitch below from behind, lift it off my left needle, and then pop both strands back on. Now we can move our knit stitch over to our left hand needle so that we can pass both strands of our third stitch over the top and off. I am now done, so I can return this stitch over to my right hand needle, and again I like to give a good tug to make sure everything stays nice and tidy. And do you see how we now have this leaning to the right? So that is our right leaning double decrease. Let's go ahead and show that continental style. I'm gonna purl one so I can get back over to a knit column. So I'm gonna be working with 3 stitches, 1, 2, 3. Stitch number 1, I slip knitwise from below. So inserting my right needle tip into the stitch below and passing it from the left over to the right. I now have 2 strands of yarn hanging out here for me. I'm going to knit the middle stitch. I'm going to pass both strands of my slip stitch over the top and off. I want to be able to pass my third stitch over the top as well, so I need to prep it by inserting my right needle tip from behind into the stitch below and lifting it on to my left hand needle so that both strands of yarn are on my left hand needle. I return the knit stitch to the left hand needle so I can pass both these strands of yarn over the top and off. It's now complete, so I return it to my right hand needle and I give it a good tug. And there is another right leaning decrease. Again, I will show you how to undo this. So you always want to undo the action on the needle it occurred on. So the last thing I did was I slipped my third stitch, both strands, over the top of my knit stitch, and I did that on my left hand needle. So I'm going to return this to my left hand needle. I know it was 2 strands of yarn, so I'm going to insert my right needle into both strands of yarn that I had slipped over the top and off, making sure not to grab anything extra. And I want to bring that back up onto my left hand needle and over the top of that knit stitch. There we go. And the move before that was to pass my first slip stitch over this knit stitch, and that occurred on my right hand needle. So I will now return my right hand needle, my stitch to my right hand needle, and I'm going to lift both stitches of this slip stitch don't want to split my yarn here, over the top of the stitch I had passed them over. I grabbed something extra there. There we go. And I need to get it over the top of the stitch that I had slipped them over. So I'm just going to use my needle tip here and my fingers to kind of pluck that stitch out. There we go. All right, and then the step before that was to knit this middle stitch. So I'm going to unknit that. I should say that if you want to get these back into their beginning orientation where they are still sitting purled from that row below, we can go ahead and re-purl this stitch just like when we undid that first decrease. Now return that middle stitch. And then we want to return this stitch. We are going in through the front to untwist it because we had slipped that one knitwise. And again, we can re-purl that stitch to get it right back to the way it was. So that is how we undo it. So there we go. We have left leaning and right leaning double decreases in half fisherman's rib. I hope you give it a try. Happy knitting.